So this video clip really focuses on this new book, Dopamine Nation, People Addicted to Pleasure, a society that is chasing pleasure instead of purpose. And this is found in many different forms: drinking, going out, smoking, just people seeking pleasure, and obviously ends in drugs. Look at this. Look at the difference in how people look after using drugs, eating, overeating, binge eating. Also in relationships where people chase and hunt the highs, the emotional highs and the pleasure of relationships over the quality and how good those relationships are for you. It also revolves about binge watching junk and getting into fantasy and fantasizing about people and things outside reality, which robs you of many hours per day.
In a world where nobody wants to be in our world, I bring you fantasy books.
I had a guy tell me once that he would never read a fantasy book because they are nothing like the real world. Yeah, that's the whole point!
Look at one of these genres in these fantasy books: enemies to lovers. This almost never happens in life. Why not avoid enemies and people who are trying to do the devil's work in your life and harm you, and rather marry good people who are trying to build you up and lead you closer to God? But this is how evil's trying to program young people to carry on with a 50% divorce rate.
It wasn't like that, okay?
Really, what was it like? A down payment now and then a bonus for sleeping with me?
No, I didn't care about the money, okay? I cared about you.
Here's what your gaming hours say about you. Less than 1 hour a day. You're either a casual gamer or a boomer playing solitaire after a hard day of work. 2 hours a day. This is the average zone, but at least gaming is just a hobby and not a problem. 3 to 4 hours a day. Your gaming hobby is turning into a passion and is now the equivalent of a part-time job. 6 to 8 hours a day. Your gaming is no longer a hobby, it's a habit and is now equivalent to a full-time job. More than 8 hours a day. You're either a hardcore gamer who is either making money playing video games or you've become a full-blown degenerate. 0 hours a day. You're living a good life. Well done.
Video games, especially video games that have a very high update speed, where there's novel territory all the time, those can release dopamine somewhere between nicotine and cocaine. So very high levels of dopamine release.
But if I use technology for the first 4 hours of the day, and then I try to go and do work,
you're not going to.
You're not going to. And even if you finish the same amount of work, you will not experience the same level of pleasure because your dopamine has literally been depleted.
Got it.
So the way that I kind of describe this is, imagine that you have a lemon that is full of juice.
Yep.
So at the very beginning, when it's full of juice, a small squeeze gets you a lot of juice. But by the end, you have to squeeze a lot to get very little juice. This is how dopamine is in our brain.
Let's just think about addiction, because in biology and in psychology, frankly, it really often pays to think about the extremes first and then work our way towards more typical circumstances. And with that said, addiction, unfortunately, is very common nowadays. I just heard a statistic, in fact, that there is an 80% increase in alcohol use disorder among women in the last 30 years. I talked a little bit about this in the episode that I did about alcohol and health. Again, I want to be very clear. I'm not somebody that is completely against alcohol for adults, provided they're not alcoholics. And yet many, many people out there, male and female alike, suffer from alcohol use disorder, also called alcoholism. The same is also true for things like methamphetamine or cocaine or other types of substance addictions. And the same is also true for a lot of behavioral, or what are sometimes called process addictions. Things like sex addiction or video game addiction, or any type of behavior that frankly is leveraging the dopamine system, but that engages this progressive narrowing of the things that bring someone pleasure, such that nothing else is really salient. Nothing else is really pulling them in the way that their video games or sex or pornography or alcohol. Pick your substance. So what's happening in addiction? Well, addiction involves dopamine, among other things, often the opioid system, etc. But if we were to think about what's the stimulus in an addiction and what's the peak in dopamine, and then what happens after that peak, it all becomes very clear as to why addiction happens and why it's so pernicious. So for instance, let's take cocaine. Cocaine causes dramatic increases in dopamine very, very fast. So if somebody craves cocaine, what are they craving? They're craving that dopamine peak. And dopamine levels almost immediately go up to a very high peak. Okay, so the time gap between the stimulus and the dopamine is very, very short. So short, in fact, that there's really no other contingencies in between that the mesocortical system has to learn. In fact, what does the system, quote unquote, learn? It learns cocaine equals massive amounts of dopamine equals feeling euphoric and energetic, etc. And in doing that, it reinforces the whole circuit so that short, we can even say hyper short contingency is really what the system wants. So much so that longer contingencies of, say, putting in the hard work of, generating a fitness program or a professional program for yourself or a education program, which takes not just many days, but many weeks and years. So that tells us something critical. It is both the duration between desire and effect. And when I say effect, I mean the rewarding properties of dopamine that are experienced. That's important. So very short gaps teach the system to expect and want short gaps. Makes it very hard to pursue things that take longer. And this is very important. The higher the peak in dopamine and the faster the rise to that peak, the further below baseline the dopamine drops after the drug wears off. Okay, so in the case of cocaine, it's a very fast and very large rise in dopamine, followed by a steep drop and very deep trough in dopamine below baseline. You say, okay, so there's pleasure, then there's lack of pleasure. But it's worse than that, because it's not just lack of pleasure. If you recall what we talked about a little bit earlier, that drop below baseline triggers the desire and the pursuit for what? For more. And so this sets in motion a vicious loop where people start pursuing peaks in dopamine that can come very fast without much effort. And that's one of the ways in which addictions start to take hold. The other thing that's absolutely critical to keep in mind, and this was discussed in my colleague, Dr. Anna Lemke's book, Dopamine Nation, and on this podcast. Excellent book, by the way. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it already. It's a fascinating exploration into dopamine as it relates to addiction, not just drug addiction, but other types of addiction. Again, the name of that book is Dopamine Nation. We'll provide a link to it in the show note captions. The other thing that happens after those big, fast increases in dopamine, afterwards, when it quickly drops below baseline, it takes a much longer time to get back to the original baseline than it did prior to using the drug. And worse still is that the peaks in dopamine that are created from more consumption leads to progressively lower peaks and deeper troughs below baseline. So the whole system is shifting away from pleasure and more to pain and the desire for pursuit of the drug. If you remember nothing else from this episode, please remember this, that when you experience something or you crave something really desirable, really exciting to you, very pleasurable, what happens afterwards is your baseline level of dopamine drops. Okay, so these peaks in dopamine, they influence how much dopamine will generally be circulating afterward. And you might think, a big peak in dopamine, after that, I'm going to feel even better because I just had this great event. Not the case. What actually happens is that your baseline level of dopamine drops. And that's what we call addiction. When somebody pursues an activity that leads to huge increases in dopamine, and now you understand that afterward, the baseline of dopamine drops because of depletion of dopamine, the readily releasable pool. The dopamine is literally not around to be released, and so people feel pretty lousy. And many people make the mistake of then going and pursuing the dopamine evoking, the dopamine releasing activity or substance again, thinking mistakenly that it's going to bring up their baseline. It's going to give them that peak again. Not only does it not give them a peak, their baseline gets lower and lower because they're depleting dopamine more and more and more. And we've seen this over and over again. When people get addicted to something, then they're not achieving much pleasure at all.